In this video, I'm going to discuss architectural exterior rendering, but instead of a daylight shot, this will be an evening or night shot. I'm aiming for kind of the time of day where I think it's called the golden hour, right when the sun sets or after the sun sets. You still have some illumination from the sky. And in this render, I'll be using a photograph for the sky instead of, say, the mental ray physical sky or something along those lines, because it really doesn't handle evening transitions very well or night shots. You can set it up to do that, but I'd rather just use an image of the sky when I'm rendering like a late shot like this or a night shot. I'll be using photometric lights, primarily photometric lights, throughout the building here, most of which will have IES profiles assigned to the lights. And I'll configure the lights with a realistic Kelvin setting that will give me a nice warm color. Say I'll use probably like a tungsten setting like I did in this render. That'll give me a really nice warm color that will contrast with this really cold sky. This will be a video on still frame rendering and not an animated sequence. I'll have a separate video where I cover animations with global illumination and final gather, just because that can be more in-depth, and I think it's better to tackle this still frame versus animation, just because the techniques are a little bit different that you have to use for the two approaches. Okay, so let's just go ahead and jump in here. Let me switch to a perspective view and move around. There are no lights in this scene set up already. It's just the model itself, and the model is textured. This is the same scene that I used for the architectural daylight render scene for that video discussion as well. Just to make sure that I've cleared out all of my settings, I'm going to go in and change the renderer, which is set up to mental ray now. I'm just going to change that to scanline and then back to mental ray as a production render. And what that does is it will just make sure that I've reset everything to the default settings here under the mental ray settings, kind of starting from scratch. And so what I want to do is go ahead and start adding some lights, because I'm already done with the texturing of the scene, so I'm ready to start lighting the scene. So probably the first place that I want to start texturing or lighting is with these spotlights here. And I've broken the scene down into layers, so I'm just going to start adding lights to this light layer. And I'll just switch to a top view and maybe turn this into maybe hidden line or wireframe view, so that I can get a better view of where those light fixtures are. And I'm just going to go to the create panel, and under lights I'm going to create a free light here. And when I do, I'm going to get this prompt to I'm using photometric lights, do you want to use the exposure control? And I do, so I'm just going to click yes and click with the left mouse button to create the light in the scene. And I'm just going to center this up underneath this light fixture, and I'm at Z height of 0, so I need to go in and change that to get the height correct. Get in here and see where this light fixture is, and I just want to put this close to the light fixture. I'm not going to put this photometric light inside the light fixture, because I'm going to assign an IES profile to this, and what I want to do is put a self-illuminated material on this globe light fixtures themselves as well. If you can find those, it'll save you some time modeling light fixtures. So here I have some IES profiles that I've downloaded from evermotion.org, and I'll just scroll through these, and basically I'm looking for something that has a narrow profile, something like this, and you can kind of see what that's going to do in the scene. This is just going to have a narrow stream of light, which will work well for this particular light source. So I'm just going to click OK here and open that. And I say it'll work well because this is going to cast light on that single beam here. So this column will be illuminated. So now let me just go to a perspective view here. And what I want to do is make sure that I have hardware shading enabled, and I can get a preview of what this is going to look like. Right now it's using the scene lights. Hardware shading is enabled. Exposure control is enabled in the viewport, and I'm going to enable shadows. And let me just move around here and see what that looks like. And right now it's a little bit bright, but that I don't want to adjust the light because this, when you download these IES files, you're under the assumption that these come from lighting manufacturers, and so they're configured with the correct lighting data for a real-world light source. So I don't want to go in and start changing the candela value or the intensity. Instead, I want to adjust my exposure control. So the exposure control, let's just go, and this is an outdoor nighttime, and you can see that that modified it to where it's not as bright. I may want to bump that up maybe one more notch, something like so. Probably looks good. And now for the color of this light source, you can come in and you have these color options here. You can select halogen or fluorescent lights, things like that if you want to do that. Personally, I just like to go in and set my own Kelvin colors here, or Kelvin temperatures, and I'm going to set this up for 3400. Just because I know that the range of a tungsten light source is like 28 to 32 or 34, somewhere around there. So I want that warm color for this particular light source. And I don't want this to be too warm because on the interior of the scene here, the lights that I'm going to put in here, I'm going to put those down to around 2800 just to get that kind of warm, cozy feeling on the inside here. And these I want just a little bit lighter, not so saturated orange as I get, or yellow for this interior. So I have that set up now. Now I just need to instance copy these lights to where I have the other CAN fixtures. So I'll just go back to the top viewport, and I'm just going to hold the shift button down and drag with the mouse to drag an instance copy of this light source. And just line that up like so. And I need to do that a couple of more times. So what I'm going to do is shift and drag again to this light fixture. I'm just going to get that kind of centered, and this time I'm going to say, give me 5 of them, I believe, instance. Now I'll have to go in and move these. So just so that I'm not moving geometry, I'm going to switch my selection type to lights only, and zoom down here and go ahead and center these up. Like so. And I'll go ahead and go through here and center these. I'll pause the video while I do it so you don't have to sit there and watch me center these lights. Okay, now I need to add 2 more. So again, I just shift drag. I'm just going to add 1 this time, because I have another light fixture here that sits out just a little bit further than the others. The height is the same though, so I don't have to worry about the Z height, modifying that. And copy 1 more. Again, I make instance copies of these so that I can, if I need to change the values, I can just change it on one, and that will correspond to all the light fixtures. Okay, and we'll switch back to my perspective view. And now you can get a update here as to what this will look like in the render, which again is a new feature here, that we can see this in kind of real time and get this kind of feedback, which is really cool. Of course, you don't have the indirect lighting to see in the viewport, but you get a pretty good idea of what the lighting is going to look like. Alright, so the next thing I want to do is add some lights under the breezeway. So I'll go back to my top viewport, and I'm just going to select one of these existing lights and shift drag with the mouse button to make another copy of this. This time I'm just going to make a copy instead of an instance because I want to modify this light. I want to use a different IES profile for the corridor, the breezeway, the walkway here. Instead of that sharp focus light, I want to use a more diffused light. So I'm going to go through, and I'll still use an IES light if I can find one, IES profile that will give me what I'm looking for. So I'm just going to scroll through and see. That one looks pretty good. That one has a nice broad distribution, so I think I'll take that one. And as you can see, these have different intensities. This one's actually 6500 candela, whereas this new light source is 600 candela. So all of that information is stored in the that IES profile. So again, assuming that those come from lighting manufacturers, they should be accurate, and you don't really need to go in and modify this, because when you do, you're getting away from that manufacturer's data. So what I'll do is just come in and move this kind of center of that walkway, which I know that's the glass, and so I'm kind of in the center now. I'll just switch to a different viewport and center that up. Let me change this to a wireframe view. And then, just so that I can move around quicker and see a little bit better, I may want to go in and hide these trees for now. That's better. So this is the floor up above us. I need to lower this down. Okay, so that's in place. So what I want to do now is just go through and again make some instance copies of this this new light, and I may want to move that back somewhere like this. And what I'll do is just copy these, maybe something like I think I'll just do every other column, and I'll say something, maybe 5 of those. Whoops, I didn't do that as an instance. Let me go back and like so, and change that to instance, and let's just say 5 and see what that looks like. Okay, this one's a little close to the wall. Let's move him out like so. And I want to do the same thing for the second floor. So I'll just grab all of these and instance copy these up to the second floor. Like so. So at this point, I think I'm ready to just give this a quick test render. And what I'm going to use for indirect illumination in this scene is just final gather only. I'm not going to use global illumination. So by default, final gather is enabled. I'm going to give this, let's say, 4 bounces. And as you can see, the default settings for the trace depth is a maximum of 5, and then you have 5 max reflections and 5 max refractions. I'm going to change the reflections, I'm going to change that to 5 since I'm getting close to 5 here. And for the precision, I'm just going to set this to low for now. I think everything else I'll leave it the default settings and just give this a quick render. Okay, that looks alright the way it is. I want to go in and kind of adjust my photographic exposure control. I have a couple of hot spots here. I want to tone those down, so I'm going to set this the highlights and burn value down to, let's just say, 0.1. And I want a little more color in here, so I'm going to set the color saturation to 1.2. And just to speed up the render, decrease the calculation time, if you will, I'm going to have it reuse the geometry just so that Mental Ray doesn't have to do a translation every time I hit the render button. And so let me give this another render. Okay, and the last thing that I want to do to my exposure control is adjust the Kelvin value. When I take pictures with my camera, and there's a couple of presets that I can use, and I kind of like to use sometimes this for the white point value. I have a daylight preset on my camera for 5400 Kelvin, And what that'll do is that's going to make the lights here a little less yellow. And when I add the sky in, it'll make it a little more blue, kind of help distinguish that warm, cool feel. Now, even though I didn't add lights down here, what you're seeing, these, if you're wondering what these two spots are, on the original render, I've added a couple of small light fixtures here, and they just have a self-illuminated material on those. Once I get to adding the actual lights, I'll talk about that a little bit further, but just in case you were wondering what that was, it's just that self-illuminated material. And also, I don't think that I mentioned that these lights have ray trace shadows on them. That's the shadow type that I'm using, just ray trace for all of the light fixtures here. These are, I believe, still set up as point lights. Sometimes when you add an IES profile, it can change it to a different shape here and become an area light. So these are both point lights for now, and that again can be controlled by that IES data, just so that you know if you add an IES file in here, it can actually change the shape of the light here and become an area light. And typically speaking, though, if you make an IES profile an area light, it kind of diffuses that pattern that you'll see here, this fake caustic pattern, if you will. If I made that an area light, that wouldn't be as well defined. It would be more of a diffuse light source. So if you're using an IES profile, you may want to just leave that alone and let that IES file change the shape of the light as needed. Okay, so next I believe I want to add some lights on the interior of the building here. So I will switch viewports again and go into the top viewport here. And for the interior, I'm not going to go through and add a bunch of lights. I'm just going to put some large, again, photometric lights. I'm just going to put a free light here. This will be an area light because I want to make this pretty large area of light to simulate multiple light fixtures, just because it's a little bit faster to render when you have fewer lights to calculate from. So I'm going to make this a rectangle and maybe something like 4x20, something like that. Again, this will go inside of the structure here. There's just a little narrow fake room, I guess you would say. Switch to different viewports so I can see what this is doing, and I want to change the distribution type on this light because, as you can see by the look of this light fixture, it's going to emit light on both directions, and I don't need that. I'm going to make this diffuse so that it only emits downward. So I'll move this down to just below the ceiling here on the first floor. Again, that's the windows, and this is the back wall, so this is kind of in the center of the ceiling here. And what I'll do is just, that's kind of the length of two of these window areas. So I'm just going to drag this again with the holding the shift button down. I drag with the mouse, and I'm going to make this an instance copy. Maybe 4 of those. That looks about right. I may want to delete this last one because there's a wall there and it was intersecting that wall. Okay, so I'm going to select those and copy those to the second floor. Again, I just hold the shift button down and drag with the mouse. Instance copy. If you don't want instance copy those, of course you can make them just regular copies. Now, since these are large area lights, the candela on that needs to be a little bit higher than these photometric lights because this is a large area. 1500 is pretty strong. I may need to reduce that, but just to check it, I'll give this a render. And I think I'll just go in and actually disable global illumination. So this is a quick render. And as that's rendering, you can tell that I did not set a specific color to that light, the lights on the interior. So I need to go in, instead of using the default value here, I can specify a Kelvin color. For the interior, I'd kind of like a more warm color than I'm having on the exterior. So again, I'm going to make this probably 2800. Although that is kind of cool looking. It kind of looks like frosted glass, and it's nice to have a little bit of a contrast there, but I prefer the warm look of this, more of an inviting appearance. So give this a render. And now I just need to check to see if those lights are too bright when I use my indirect illumination. So let me just enable that. Run a quick render of this, because I don't want, I may need to adjust those light intensity of those lights on the interior if they're too bright for the indirect illumination settings. So it does look like I want to decrease the intensity of those interior lights just a bit, because I'm losing some of the subtle detail of the interior that you can see from the original render, where I do have just a little bit of detail on the wall here where the wall and the ceiling meet, and that's getting blown out. So I'm just going to decrease that to, I'm going to say 1100. Now I have one more interior light to add, and that's for this L section of the building here. So let me just go back up to the top viewport, and I'll just grab one of these lights and again shift drag over to this area. I'm going to use this as a copy instead of an instance, because I need to change the size of this light, obviously. So the width looks pretty good the way it is. I just need to change the length value. Probably something like so. And then just move this one into place as well. And I'm just going to drag it down like so. Now I may need to increase the strength of this one just because it's a larger light source now. So what I'll do to test that is I'll just render a region. Just around those windows. Okay, that looks pretty good the way it is, so I'll turn region rendering off. And next, I believe I'll go ahead and add some of these uplights around this area of the building. So I'll just switch back to a top view again and select probably one of these IES lights here. Shift and drag a copy of this out, and I want to rotate this 180 degrees like so, so that this light source is pointing up, and I'm going to place it somewhere over here. I'll move it into position here in a different viewport. I think I'll go into the camera viewport here and change that to a perspective. Let me just turn off edge faces so I can move a little bit quicker. You'll see some crazy things here just because of the gaming video card that I'm using. Obviously you can see the psychedelic colors. That seems to go away. I'm sure it's a driver issue or something to do with my video card. It tends to go away when I enable edge faces here. For these uplights, I want to use a different IES file than what I have assigned here. Oops, that's a little too far. I don't want this sharp effect. I want a more smooth light. So again, I'll go looking for another IES profile here, and I'll just scroll through these and see what I can find. Again, I want a nice wide soft view, something kind of like that maybe. And I'm just looking down here. When I say kind of like that, as I'm scrolling through, I'm scrolling with the arrow key on my keyboard and just watching here in the box as to what the light will look like. That one looks pretty good. And so you can see that gives a nice soft look here. One thing that you can do is change the rotation of the lights here. Wish that would update. Again, that's my video card. On a better video card, I'm sure that would update without getting over bright like that. But you can change the angle. Maybe something like that may be too extreme. Something like so. And then I probably want 2 of those on this wall. And I'll make that an instance copy. And I want to copy these around to the side of the building as well. So I'm just going to shift drag to make another copy. And rotate this light 90 degrees. And move into place. And make another copy. And that's fine for those. And again, you'll notice that I don't have light fixtures modeled for these, just because it's a demo, just to set up the lighting, but also you wouldn't see this by the particular angle that I'm going to render it at, so there wasn't really the need to model light fixtures for those. Let me just turn on edge faces again to get rid of these artifacts. And as you can see, again, you get a update in the viewport as to what this is going to look like, and it's starting to shape up. So what I'll do next is add the lights to the step area here, and I'm just going to grab one of these lights that I just made. Actually, I'll just grab this one since I haven't changed the rotation or anything on that. Drag a copy of this instead of an instance copy out, and I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees. I have snapping enabled so that I can quickly rotate to a certain percentage here, by the way, to enable that an angle snap toggle option here. Let me just zoom into this light, and I can just move it into place. And now this IES profile may not be the best one to use here for the steps, because I would want a more smooth light more than likely. So I'm just going to change the profile here on these step lights. Maybe something a little more smooth. Maybe that. Yeah, that looks better. Let me switch to a viewport to move this into place. So now I'm in the left viewport, and I'm just going to center this kind of like so. Drag an instance copy of it down to the other light fixture. And as I said, on these light fixtures, let me switch to geometry here for a second and pull up the material editor and grab this material. I have the casing, and I also have a self-illuminated Arc and Design material. In the filter slot of this one, what I've done is put a gradient ramp to kind of give me an effect like this, kind kind of like the light is in the center, and what that'll do is give a nice soft glow to this object. Okay, so now all I need to do is copy these lights to the other light fixtures along the steps. So I'll just switch back to my selection of lights, and I'll select these and make instance copies. And this time I'll just quickly go to the mirror tool to change the direction on those lights. Alright, and then do the same thing. I just shift drag to the other side here. Okay, so now those are set up. So I believe the only other lights that I need to add here would be a skylight, and use my texture map, but also I have those trees that are still hidden, and I need to add some uplights to those as well. So let me go into my layers and unhide the tree objects. So now I'll know where to put these light fixtures. Again, under the tree objects here, I'm just going to drag some of these lights here. I don't have light fixtures modeled, but you won't notice it from the render angle that I'm going to render this from, so no big deal. And I'm just going to make a copy of this, because I may want to change the IES profile again for this. Okay, so let me just move this into place. Let's see what that looks like. First, because I know I'm going to use a JPEG or an image, a bitmap for my sky map, and I want to draw some color from that. So to do that, I am going to switch to the standard, and I'm just going to drop a skylight into the scene. Again, I'm not using the mental ray sun and sky for this, because it doesn't really work too well for night scenes like this. You can set it up that way, but it's not optimal. So rather than spending time changing with the settings on that and trying to guess what the night sky should be like, I'm just going to drop a skylight in and run with that. So I want to make sure that this skylight is configured to use the scene environment, and by default it's set up for the sky color, but since I had already added one to the scene earlier when I did some testing, it's using the scene environment. So make sure that it uses that, and then I'm going to go to my scene environment, and I'm just going to assign a gamma and gain utility shader here, and drag that over to the material editor as an instance copy. And again, I'm using this gamma and gain utility shader so that I can modify the gamma of whatever map I'm going to use, and I can also give it a multiplier if needed. And so for the bitmap, I'm actually going to use an HDR image here, and it's of a night sky here, so it should give me some nice render results. And I'll just open that, and I'm going to use a floating point real pixel format with the default exposure control or exposure option here. And of course I need to change that. The first thing I need to do is change that to a spherical mapping, so I can see what this is going to look like kind of in the viewport, and I can rotate that if needed. I can rotate it around, and I can go back whoops, wrong button. I can go back here to the gain and multiplier value, and I can make this a little bit brighter, which I'll need to, something like 0.025. And lower value makes it brighter when you have this reverse gamma option enabled. If I uncheck that, then that's then it would actually decrease the energy if you were using like a gamma of 1.0 and a JPEG or something. So I'm actually going to change that gamma to 1.0 here, since this is a linear image, and leave the gain multiplier here at 0.025. Now I'll also want to enable this process background and environment maps since I'm using 3ds Max 2010, because this functions with the photographic exposure control in 2010, so I'll need to enable that. And let me just switch to a camera view. This is the view that I'm going to be rendering. And while everything is still set up for a fast render, let me just give this a preview. That looks about right. I stopped that render because the results here look pretty good. I could go in and actually fudge a little bit and make this a little bit darker or more saturated, a darker, deeper blue by changing this gamma. Even though that's incorrect for this format, typically HDRs have a gamma of 1.0 or in linear format, but if I increase that, you can see it kind of darkens it up here. So even though that's technically wrong, I'm going to increase that just to give this a little darker of a color. And I may also want to enable vignetting in the exposure control settings. And I'll just make a copy or clone this so that you can see the different results. Now you can see how that's going more towards purple, a really dark color here on the edge, which is closer to what I have in the original render. So with that, I believe I'm ready for the final render. So what I'll do is go in and increase my settings, increase the image precision or anti-aliasing to 1 in 16. I want to change my image size to something like maybe 1200, and for indirect illumination I need to enable that. And I think I'll set it to medium, and if you can get by with it, you may want to turn off this noise filtering. I'd set it to none. I'm just going to go ahead and take a risk and set that to none, because what that'll do is just give you a little more indirect illumination. This basically cancels out some indirect illumination to provide a smoother result between having over bright spots. I haven't seen any problem areas where I may have that in this particular render, so I'm just going to set that to none and give this a render. Basically I know that I can because I've already tried it in this render, so when you're doing the test you may want to test that on a small render instead of the final render, but since I already know I'm going to get a decent result out of it, I'm just going to leave it set to none. And I'm ready to hit the render button. And there we have the completed render. Let me just turn this off. And from there I took it into Photoshop and made some adjustments, subtle adjustments to the color, added a little bit of sharpness. In this render I also had the glare shader enabled, which gave it a little bit of a soft glow. I had forgot to enable that here in this render. So don't forget, you may want to use that glare camera shader for these bright light sources, especially to give a little bit of a glow effect to those. But that's a basic exterior render for like a night scene. Again, you can just use the IES profiles with those photometric lights and just really go through and set up a scene pretty quick. And since there's no sun to worry about, I just went ahead and used the skylight with this HDR image that I had. So it's as you can see, it's a fairly quick setup and gives pretty good results. And so that will conclude the this video.